All right, we have the start of the hour, and I want to thank everyone who has joined in for this ideal webinar program for 2024. I'm Pedro Ramirez. I am a gynecologic oncologist at Houston Methodist Hospital here in Houston. I'm also part of the Ideal Council, and we're really very excited to have this opportunity today to share a great discussion with the leadership of the Ideal framework. Certainly, I think that this is a great opportunity for us to learn, to ask questions, leaders within the field of surgical research. I think, certainly as all of us who are involved in surgical research, we value the importance of establishing the quality of the research, the implementation of that research, and I think certainly this speaks to the mission of the Ideal framework. Ideal stands for Ideas Development, Exploration, Assessment, and Long-Term Evaluation. So with that, I want to again thank all of you for joining this hour discussion and presentation. I do also want to encourage all of those who have joined to please submit your questions through the chat, and we are going to have a opportunity for engagement in that discussion with all of our speakers. In terms of housekeeping, I would like to request that all of you, please mute your microphones so that we will not have interruptions or unexpected interruptions during the discussion. And I will also add that all of the slides are presented here today will be available to all of those who register for the program. So with that, I would like to introduce our panelists. Our panelists are Dr. Peter McCulloch, Dr. Joel Horowitz, and Dr. Arsenio Paez, and each of them are going to speak on topics that are very relevant to the field of surgical research. We'll start with an introduction with Peter McCulloch, who is a professor of surgical science and practice at the Nuffield Department of Surgical Sciences at the University of Oxford and the chair of the Ideal Collaboration. So Peter is going to talk to us about the genesis and the history of Ideal. This is a brief overview, of course, but we're really very excited to have Peter with us. And Peter, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to speak on this webinar.
Great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Pedro. It's a great pleasure. So my name is Peter McCulloch. I'm a professor of surgery at Oxford University, and I'm chair of the Ideal Collaboration. And I want to explain to you a little bit about what Ideal is and what it's useful for. And this is going to be taken through in more detail by the other speakers. So Ideal is basically an integrated evaluation pathway for surgery. In other words, it can guide you through how to scientifically evaluate surgical operations all the way from the very first one done in a human to long-term study in things like registries. The pharma industry, of course, has had an integrated evaluation pathway for more than 70 years. We all know about the phase 1 to phase 4 trial designs. And famously, the pharma industry has made great advances because of the randomized controlled trials they do in phase 3. But they need to build up to that by studying different questions before they get to the randomized trial. In phase 1, it's about toxicity, and in phase 2, it's about dose finding and efficacy. Surgeons have been criticized for not doing enough randomized trials and high enough quality randomized trials, but we suffer from challenges that the pharma industry don't. These are some of the chief challenges to randomized trials in surgery. Surgical operations are infinitely variable, unlike pharmacological compounds, so we need to define exactly what is a particular operation and agree it. All surgical operations start with a first one, and after the first one, there is often a series of iterative modifications until we reach a stable version of the operation. So at the beginning of an operation's career, if you like, it's not suitable for comparison because it's still evolving. We also know that surgical operations can be done well or not so well. And it's important that if you're going to test an operation, everybody who's in the trial can do it to a reasonable and agreed standard of quality. So this is where learning curves come in. Finally, there's the idea of equipoise. Randomized controlled trials require us to take the attitude that we don't know at the outset whether the new treatment's better than the old treatment. This is very difficult for surgical pioneers who've championed an operation to do, and this difficulty can often transmit itself to the patients we treat. So we have these difficulties. How can we overcome them? We started to address this in a series of conferences in Oxford, 2007 to 2009 at Balliol College, which is where the IDEAL framework was developed. The idea was, let's do the same as the pharma people and look at the life cycle, not the life cycle of a drug, but the life cycle of an operation and how it evolves through these 5 stages that we described. If we look at what happens in the 5 stages in the IDEAL framework, stage 1 is just the first in human operation. And all we're suggesting there is that we're completely transparent with people about what we did and what the outcomes were. In stage 2A, we have this phase where the operation is rapidly being changed to try and perfect it and stabilize. After this, more surgeons start to take up the operation, and inevitably controversy develops because people develop small variations or they disagree with each other about the indications for an operation. This is also the stage at which people begin to worry about learning curves and whether that might interfere with evaluation. If we can get through this stage, then we can get to stage 3 and do a randomized trial together. But we need to get a consensus in stage 2B before we can do that. And then we have stage 4, which is long-term monitoring, which is essentially the same as it would be for a drug. If you look at these 5 stages, there's a key question to be answered at each one of them. In the first one, it's pretty simple. It's just, what is this new treatment? In stage 2A, the question is, by the end of the stage, have we perfected and stabilized it so we can define it? Stage 2B is where we require consensus between all the clinicians about the precise definition of what the operation comprises and which variations are acceptable and the indications. Stage 3 is where we get to compare it with alternatives or with a placebo. And if possible, we should be doing this in a randomized trial. And in stage 4, the questions really, are there any surprises? Are there any late effects or rare effects that we didn't spot before? So the IDEAL framework gives us a picture of the life cycle of a surgical operation. The IDEAL recommendations look at these questions that characterize each stage and make recommendations for how those questions could best be answered in a scientific study. The novelty that IDEAL introduced was these 2 stages here, development and exploration. Prior to the IDEAL framework, there was no real understanding of what you should do scientifically between the first in human and the randomized trial. As will be explained later, in both of these stages, we feel that the best study designs for a surgical operation should be variants on a prospective cohort study. In the assessment stage, a randomized trial is still the best design for determining whether one treatment is better than another. And just like drugs, we believe that registries are the way to go for long-term study. The philosophy we developed, which helped us to build this framework, was started with the idea that we shouldn't be doing any new operations without evaluating them properly. We should adhere to the pillars of medical ethics in terms of beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, and justice. And we should be as transparent as possible with people, both patients and our peers and the public, about what we're doing and what the outcomes are. We should match our evaluation methods to the key questions, as I've explained, and we should only do a randomized trial when we're ready and when it's justified. So what can we do with this evaluation pathway for surgery? Well, if it was widely adopted, we believe IDEAL would transform surgical research in terms of its validity, reliability, and credibility. We've also found, interestingly, in the last couple of years, that the IDEAL approach can also be applied to digital medicine and robotics. And we've published twice now in Nature Medicine, first on the use of an IDEAL type approach called Decide AI to evaluate medical AI at its early stages. And laterally this year on how to evaluate surgical robots. The third thing we're looking into is whether IDEAL can be used to help make the adoption of innovations safer, both using well-known innovations, but adopting them in different centers, and particularly focusing on the safe adoption of technology in lower income countries. We often hear that IDEAL is common sense, but we're quite happy about that. One of the greatest philosophers ever, René Descartes, had this to say about common sense. And if it's good enough for René Descartes, we believe it's good enough for surgeons. Thank you.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for that introduction. And I'd like to then now pass on the word to Professor Joel Horowitz. He's a professor of clinical surgery at SUNY Downstate School of Medicine in Brooklyn, New York. He's a senior vice chairman of surgery and also has been with the IDEAL Council since its inception and has been the leader in education within that council. And I always enjoy listening to Joel and talking about what is evidence-based medicine and the different types of studies. So, Professor Horowitz.
Thank you, Pedro, for the kind introduction. As Pedro said, I'm an old-time general surgeon who has had a long love association with evidence-based medicine. So I just want you to know that I was tasked with trying to make some EBM type comments about these things. And so here's what we're going to cover during this talk. We're going to go over the history of surgical trials, because I think that's worthwhile from the EBM point of view. Taxonomy, how to identify trial types, since Peter's already said you need to be able to do an RCT. How are we going to identify that? And are there any issues or problems with that? So I'd like to start by going over this timeline of the history of medical trials. It's kind of interesting. You can see big time diseases from way back being treated or being investigated rather with rather small groups. An N of 6 seems to be a very popular, it seemed to be a popular thing. But for EBMers, this James Lind study on the treatment of scurvy is always held out as the paradigm as the first randomized trial in history. With an N of 6 groups, or an N of 12 rather, in 6 groups, you can see that not much of a p-value here could be obtained. And just for purposes of EBM, we should note that in 1763, statistics were put on the map when Bayes published his theorem. And modern frequentist statistics were not published until 1926, when Fisher introduced hypothesis testing and the dreaded p-value, which we suffer from still today. And it wasn't until 20 years later, 1946, that Austin Hill did the first randomized trial in the world in the treatment of tuberculosis with streptomycin. And that started us off on the modern era. Now, as Peter said, surgeons had a rather mixed affair with EBM. And up until, well, actually, still, surgeons have favored retrospective case series or case reports. And a very small percentage of cases, of papers rather, in the surgical literature have to do with RCTs. So Horton, who was then and still is the editor of The Lancet in 1996, wrote a rather scathing editorial saying that surgical research was akin to comic opera. There were questions, but few answers. And so this stimulated the surgeons, trialists, and statisticians to get together at Balliol, like Peter said. And with all due respect, Peter actually, before this is an article that he wrote on randomized trials in surgery problems and possible solutions. This was published in 2002. So this is before the era of admonishing surgery. So let's look at some of these principles here and talk a little bit about taxonomy of studies and how this is changing. when I was a trainee, I was taught that all epidemiologic studies were either observational or interventional. And basically, that's still true today. The problem is that there are a lot of nuances and a lot of things have changed, and it's changing rapidly. And so if you're going to practice evidence-based medicine, which is a commitment to lifelong learning, we got to get with the new program. So this is the hierarchy of incidence, of evidence, I'm sorry. So not all evidence is the same. And this is the evidence-based triangle, which was first published in 1995 by Dave Sackett at Oxford University. He was professor of medicine there and started the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine. And so if we look, surgery occupied the lower rungs of the evidence-based triangle, and it went up from there until we got to randomized control trials and then systematic reviews of RCTs, which is the pinnacle of the triangle. And as you go up the triangle, you decrease the amount of risk of bias. So the higher you are, the better it is. So that's why the EBM says you have to do a randomized trial. So can we do that? So just for your information, there's a new EBM triangle, which was published in the November issue of Nature in 2023 by Subia. And when I first saw this, I thought, this is like climate change has affected the evidence-based triangle, but it hasn't. So the stuff above is the same as the old evidence-based triangle, but the parts that seem to be submerged are very important. These are all sources of new data that weren't known in the past. These are all AI-based, deep precision medicine things, genomics, microbiolomics, all kinds of real-world data, natural history data, etc. So none of these things were ever known at the time when the taxonomy of trials was identified. So just to reiterate what Peter said, we want to answer the question and be transparent about it. And so IDEAL says if you want to use IDEAL, you have to be able to describe the study formats designed to do that. So we'll spend a little bit of time on taxonomy of trials further, and don't be overwhelmed by this beautiful algorithm, actually, which came from Canada in 2021. This will allow you to easily, in a few minutes, figure out exactly what kind of trial you're dealing with. So I would like you to pay attention to the green rhomboids on the left-hand side, because those are the questions that you're going to ask to get the answers to allow you to classify the study. And it's really easy. There are only 3 ways that participants can be chosen to be part of a trial. First, it can be on outcome at the top here. So if you choose by outcome, it's by definition a case control study. If the participants were chosen on the basis of a natural exposure, then it's a cohort study. And if it was a deliberate exposure, this gets a little more complicated, but by and large, if they were 2 groups and they were randomized at the beginning, then that's an RCT. And there are varieties of RCTs which are not randomized, and those are the other little yellow tabs. So you can see in 30 seconds, you can easily figure out where you are on this algorithm. And I really think it's a very valuable thing to have. So why has the RCT been labeled as the epitome of all trials? It's because of the topmost pro here, and that is it eliminates confounders. That's the whole purpose of randomization, is that you eliminate confounders, which you cannot do in an observational study. Even if you use propensity matching and all kinds of other things, you can't do it perfectly. So therefore, it is currently considered the gold standard for studying the effects of an intervention. And that's why it's recommended by IDEAL to do this at stage 3. So there's some cons to this that we need to work on and elucidate. First, the worst thing is that it's very, very costly to do this trial. an RCT, and it can take a long time. Just ask Pedro about doing his famous trial. It can be very, very daunting. So despite that, it is still recommended to be the way to go for the stage 3 trial. So, but it's not as simple as I stated before. This slide happens to illustrate the 18 different nuances of randomized trials. So when you decide we have a new operation, we're at stage 3, let's do an RCT. What kind of RCT are you going to do? So we clearly do not have time to go over all of these different varieties. We're going to go over a couple of them because I think it's important, because I think most of the audience consists of oncologically attuned people. And so therefore, I'd like you to pay attention to the left-hand side of this slide. So we see that there are two trials here, two types of trials, which are relatively new. One is called the basket trial, and the other is the umbrella trial. And these come to us solely because of the fact that we finally figured out that all cancers come from genetic cause. And we've been able to beat a genetic map of everybody's tumor and pick out personalized targeted drugs which can be used. So you're going to see a lot of these in oncology. So the basket trial, think of a basket which contains multiple different types of tumors, all of which can be treated with the same targetable drug. So you'll see a lot of those, and the FDA has made a special access to these kind of trials for oncology. The umbrella trial, on the other hand, is a very interesting issue in which you have an umbrella, which is one type of tumor, but you have multiple targeted drugs which are possible to treat the tumor with. And so that's the structure of the umbrella trial. The paradigm for this would be, of course, non-small cell lung cancer, for which there are many targeted agents. But so these are things which you're going to see more of in the future. And so you should know a little bit about them. So I said that there were some problems with the interpretation of RCTs, and we'll kind of wrap up the discussion by talking a little bit about bias, which is systematic error, and it limits the generalizability of your RCT and is frequently due to shortcomings in trial design or the implementation of the trial. On the right-hand side of the slide, you can see the sources of bias, and some of them are really obvious, like publication bias. We all want to read a positive paper. When I write a paper that says there's no relationship between A and B, the editor is not going to get excited. And the people who go on to read the trial are not going to get excited. So they, and selection bias, of course. For those of you who are really interested in bias, there is a catalog of bias at the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine, which you can get on the internet easily. And it has 50 biases, which you can play around with. It's very interesting reading. So this is a study which I recommend that you read. It appeared in JAMA Open in 2021. And what they did was they actually did a systematic review of all randomized trials in all forms of surgery, including GYN surgery, from 2008 to 2020, so 13 years worth of trials in every journal that they could find. And they analyzed them as to things like what kind of biases they had. Did they register the trial, etc. All these things that an evidence-based person would go through to critically appraise the trial. And I'll just tell you, you'll have to read yourself, but I'll just tell you that you shouldn't be shocked to know that 79% of all the randomized trials had some problem or other with the characteristics that rendered their results perhaps questionable. And finally, since evidence-based medicine, one of the aspects of it is a dedication to lifelong learning, we have to note that artificial intelligence is changing everything. I think that if you look at this review, it was published in The Lancet in February of 2024, and it's written by the people from the NIH. It's an excellent discussion about what's going to happen and how you can maintain your fluency in the literature, because you're going to have to search that forever. So with that, I'll turn it over to Pedro. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you so much, Joel, and I'm sure we'll have a number of questions for you at the end. And our next speaker is Arsenio Paez. He's going to be speaking on implementing the IDEAL framework in research strategies for success. Arsenio is a clinical epidemiologist and trials methodologist with the IDEAL collaboration at the University of Oxford and a senior lecturer at the Booth College of Health Sciences in Northeastern University of Boston. Arsenio. Arsenio, I think you're muted. So
okay, there we go.
There we go.
Good. So everybody, welcome, bienvenidos, bienvenu, benvindo, benvenuti, any other language I can think of to welcome you in. I'm happy to welcome you from sunny and beautiful Montreal just now in Canada. And I'd like to tell you a bit about how to use IDEAL. So how can you put IDEAL to work? And of course, my first thought typically would have been, great, I can't wait to do that RCT. But should I rush to the RCT? Maybe yes, maybe not yet, maybe not ever. Really what we're looking for with IDEAL is better trials. We're not just looking for more trials. We're looking for better trials that fit surgery better. And really the RCT is not magic. It can't outperform what it's meant to do. It's all about questions. In the end, all research is about questions. We teach medicine by teaching stories. We do medicine by asking questions. What makes something better? What makes something worse? What we need is more quality, better research, better questions that give us better options. Questions that let us know more about what we're testing. Does it need testing? How should we test it? Can we test it in a way that's reproducible? Is the actual surgical intervention itself reproducible? Is it ready for the next stage? So we're going to talk about how we can do that so that we can prepare for the best, to give that intervention the best possible chance of being tested fairly. And again, just to remind you, IDEAL tends to work on these questions. And there are certain guiding ones that you heard about before from Peter. In the first stage, where we're asking about what the treatment is, can it work? And then how we go about asking whether it's stable, does it need a little more modification? Then can we agree on what it is? Do we agree who should get it in stage 2B? Then we can start looking at whether it's better than something else that we currently use, and then we can start monitoring over time. And we're going to talk about how to do that specifically. One thing that I'd like to draw your attention to also with IDEAL is that we also have our reporting guidelines that can help you in that. It's always useful to see what the reporting guidelines ask for. It helps you sometimes to plan in reverse. You can find them on the Equator Network. Later on today, you'll get some more resources where to find information, but I would highly recommend keeping in mind of those also. So let's look at stage 1. You've got this surgery that this technique that you really want to start researching and getting evidence for. Here, what we're asking is, can it work? This is typically your first in living human, because a lot of surgical techniques and a lot of devices get tested on cadavers, that get tested with animals, that computer simulations. This is where we're really looking at this for the first time in a living human being. It's your proof of concept. So it can sometimes also be something that's been used before, but never in this population. So for example, something that's being used with a completely different age group or indication, or a new variety, a new modification of something that exists already. It helps us to begin the process of defining the intervention and really collecting data that will help guide how the intervention evolves and how the evidence for it evolves. And these are typically case studies, a case study or case studies, a very limited number of patients, one practitioner, one surgeon, one center. And again, what we're really looking for here is early effects. Is this promising enough that we can continue? Are there indications that it's reasonably safe enough that we can continue? Is it worthy of further study? And I have to stress something that's really interesting. We all hear about, file door effects and publication bias and all that. But here, failure is as important as success. The reason being that if something doesn't work at this stage, you have the opportunity to ask very important questions. Why didn't it work? What might have made it not work, or what can be done to make it work better? You can help other people avoid your mistakes. You can also help the field learn better. So I'll show you an example of one. You can find all of these on our Ideal website. We'll have a publication list for you. But just an example of how you can spot when there is one of these, and you can get some idea of what goes into them. This case series that was a first in human study. Typically, once now that you've proven that this, that in this stage one, in this proof of concept, that there's some reasonable indication that it's safe and may have effects, then we can move on to the stage two. And this is one of those really important stages for Ideal. This is where we really add a lot of value, because it's that stage that bridges the early clinical experience with an intervention with gathering evidence for it and helping it to develop more. So before we proved that something was relatively safe, but we weren't sure and effective, but some of the parameters weren't settled yet, and this is typical for new interventions. Here we're trying to define things more. We want to refine and standardize more. We want to get a better sense of what the intervention is. What does it look like? What is the intervention? What is it not? What would we call it? That can be really interesting also. Sometimes what we name a procedure can change dramatically from one place to the other. We start thinking about who it's for. What are the limits of it? In other words, who's the right kind of person, the right kind of patient, the right kind of surgeon? Is it ready for a larger number of patients and practitioners? We're typically doing this at this stage in prospective single center case series. Again, single center, so we're trying to really get a handle of how this performs now with more patients than we did when we proved the concept before. And this is important because, again, at this stage, these are often techniques that are not yet stable. You may have innovated a technique. You may have innovated a modification to a technique. It's not yet set, so to speak. And so here we get to really start looking at reporting changes in the intervention. You tried it before, you proved the concept, but now you're trying it with 6 or 7 or 8 patients instead of 1 or 2. Are there any changes that you had to make? Why did you have to make those changes? What happened when you made those changes? We're really looking at being very transparent and documenting thoroughly everything that took place so that others can learn more quickly and learn more safely and not repeat mistakes or not repeat versions of that intervention that aren't as effective. So again, typically a small number of cases, so it doesn't slow the development of the intervention. It doesn't slow the development of the line of research. It doesn't increase costs. An important thing, of course, also is that it's ethically superior to what we currently do. I can't emphasize enough. Ideal really works on asking questions, but it also works on very strong ethics-based principles. So in these, prospective development 2A studies, what we're looking for, a perspective account of all of the cases consecutively and their results. It's really, again, detailed technical description of the intervention. How did you do it? How does one do it? How does it work? The patient selection criteria, who should it be done with? Who's the right kind of patient for this? What modifications were made in this series and why? You know this already. I know I do. Oftentimes I'll read a paper and I can't tell why something was done. I can't actually tell what was done. So this helps to overcome that. Why were the modifications made? What was the result of them? We really want to look at an emphasis on the technical outcomes, the feasibility, the safety. We're not yet comparing it to something else. It's not usually that intervention isn't ready for a comparison yet, but this is helping build it so that you can get ready for comparison later on to something else. Here's another example you'll be able to find on our website of a nice Ideal prospective development study looking at robotic esophagectomy, and it gives you a sort of a nice overview of some of the benefits. In this case, how one modification led to a better nodal yield. And so that modification was one that you can say, okay, this is a modification we want to carry forward. So let's say you've now moved beyond that. Your development, your intervention has developed in such a way that you're ready to expand this a bit. This is where we go now into exploration, into 2B. Here you have interventions now that are more stable. You prove the concept, you kind of modified here and there on the earlier phases. You think it's now relatively stable. You've got some parameters for it. Now we want to see if that surgery, that technique, can be replicated by others. It's one thing when you do it, it's oftentimes it's your modification, your innovation. Can others do it successfully also? We're looking for evaluations of the quality of the delivery of the intervention, the variations in technique. As you know, often there are lots of reasons why we have to vary a technique unexpectedly. We're looking at learning curves. One of the things to keep in mind sometimes, especially with innovative procedures, when we see a study of these procedures, we have to wonder sometimes how much of those early results are due to the surgeons learning how to do the procedure, but also getting better at it throughout the study. So we start seeing how much of a learning curve is required, and so we start thinking a bit more about what we may need to do to prepare for a larger study. A very important thing is we also start looking at equipoise, patient and clinicians' preferences and values. This is incredibly important. What you need to know, will patients be willing to enter a study with this as one of the choices? Will surgeons be willing to perform that surgery or be randomized to perform that surgery? So these tend to be more collaborative prospective cohort studies, again, more providers, typically more centers, and typically a larger number of participants or patients. And again, I can't emphasize enough that this is such an important stage because it really helps you define the intervention and finalize agreement on the parameters of it before you go off to a randomized trial, and to help you decide whether it's safe and effective enough to go off to a randomized trial. You're looking now at patient selection criteria, quality standards, looking at different outcomes that may arrive in certain pre-specified subgroups that you may have reasonable reason to expect there might be different responses and outcomes. It helps you, and this is very important, also helps you to accumulate data for a reasonable sample size and power calculations. More often than not, we just do whoever we can get. The first, we have 15 good enough. This actually helps you to get reasonable data for something that's innovative to say, well, will that be enough to give us a reasonably statistically significant result if it's there to be had? It's just an important contribution. Also helps us achieve consensus. Can we agree what the best outcome measure is? Can we agree what the best out would be? Can we agree what the best comparison would be for this intervention so that we have a better shot at a successful randomized trial afterwards? We get to use all of the data we gather to develop a better randomized trial. A lot of randomized controlled trials may fail or not be successful because they're missing these components, because these steps weren't part of the package before. But there's something else that's, again, quite important. We do the to-be often because it improves the trust and the understanding between we, the investigators, and the surgeons and the participants. It helps us to answer very important questions that can often hold up in RCT. And I can tell you, when applying for grants and for funding, this is becoming a bigger part of the grant funding application process. It helps to answer questions about who's suitable for it, how many patients you're likely to need. Again, it gives you better information for those calculations. It gives you better information about whether they will come. I know a lot of grant applications I've been involved with. One of the first questions we get is, how do you know people will be willing to be randomized? What's your sense of that? It helps us to figure out what questions are important to the participants, the patients. Did we choose an outcome that no one will care about in clinical practice, for example, or the patients don't feel is the most important one? And also what variations are acceptable. And it gives us a sense, again, are our colleagues still learning? Are we going to have a difficult time recruiting surgeons, for example, who have sufficient skill to produce the technique during the trial, or do we need to build in training? It's again, the biggest contribution, improving the quality and feasibility of the RCT, or letting you know in advance that it may not be feasible. This is a great example you can find again on our website about looking at high intensity focused ultrasound ablation for uterine fibroids. I'll tell you the take home message of this was that the equipoise wasn't there. It made it clear that it was very unlikely that a randomized trial of this would be able to recruit sufficient number of people to be feasible. Because again, keep in mind with funding, the problem isn't always just the money. Sometimes it's actually the time, the strict time limits. So, we've gone through the stages of proving the concept, of really solidifying the technique. We know what it is now. We think we have a good shot at a feasible randomized trial. What does IDEAL recommend? And here, what we recommend is we're looking at evaluating the relative effectiveness or even the cost effectiveness of your innovative technique or procedure against something else. And typically it's a randomized controlled trial. There are other options. It's not, that would take a whole other presentation by itself, but there are other options. But it's typically some kind of randomized controlled trial, a comparison with an alternative treatment or placebo. And yes, there are surgical placebos. Those have come a great long way. a topic for another time as well, but if you're interested, email me. Yeah. Ideal adds guidance to follow some of the standard things that we already have. So for example, Consort, Consolidated Standards Reporting, that gives excellent guidance for planning a randomized trial. So we encourage more use of that and more adherence to it, but also adding a focus on intervention fidelity. And by fidelity, I mean how well was the procedure done? What actually took place during the surgery? How much did that surgery look like the surgery that we intended in the protocol? So we recommend following guidance from Spirit, for example, the standard protocol items for interventional trials. They've been out for a while. It helps to pre-plan what data to collect and to really think about collecting data about what was actually done, what variations were done, within what you consider were allowable variations, were there any surprises that caused unexpected variations to take place? Were there learning curves? Also, was there any equipoise in consent? There's always a bit of surgeon bias. I mean, I would say I'm never biased. I know my studies are perfect. There's no bias there, but there's always a bit of bias. So that's something we look at too. There's a great quote that the only perfect trial that ever exists is the trial that's planned by somebody who does not do research. I believe that. So wrapping up a bit, you've gone through this long process now, this really exciting process actually of sort of seeing your innovation, seeing this technique, seeing this program of treatment go into a randomized controlled trial. You've got a sense now, hey, this is actually effective, it has efficacy, it has effectiveness. Now we start looking at long-term monitoring. And much like that little man about to put that bolt in with somebody going right behind him, there can be surprises. That surprise would have me fall over in a heart attack, but oftentimes we're looking at long-term effects and long-term change. We're looking at any risks that may come late, and rare adverse effects that we may not see until we have a larger cohort of people who've had this over and a longer period of time to follow them. We're looking for differences in outcomes and their causes. Sometimes that will become apparent over time. So we start identifying subgroups of people who respond differently that we may not have anticipated before, especially because, we're also dealing with very innovative procedures. The important thing is we're also looking at problems in delivery and quality over time. Things can change over time, and we've seen that. We've seen that with devices. We've seen that with other surgeries, that sometimes the procedure changes over time, and that's something we have to monitor. We tend to do this with observational studies, so your prospective cohorts, registry-based studies. We see that a lot with medical devices, for example. Sometimes it could be randomized controlled trials if they build in a very long follow-up arm. There are also other interesting ways of adding to this, for example, mixed method and qualitative studies that give a sense of the experience of participants and also the experience of surgeons over time. That can give us a really important information. And again, the reason that this matters is that a lot of the surgical interventions we work with, they have long effects, and especially with implantable devices, for example. So we really want to monitor how things change over time in a way we wouldn't be able to in the short term. A lot of the impairments that and conditions people are coming to us with now are also chronic. So there are any number of unforeseen changes over time, not just as the patient changes, but as the device changes. A lot of devices now also are constantly updated for different reasons. That causes changes we need to monitor. But there's also indication and performance creep. Sometimes there's a change in use or practice. We tend to see things that get used in populations that they weren't necessarily indicated for, often without really great evidence for that. And we've seen any number of problems arise as a result of that. And when you get to the website, and I really highly encourage you to, you'll find great examples of sort of surveillance-based studies, of long-term cohort studies that give you a sense of what an ideal 4 looks like. And again, some of these examples are not necessarily in this field. Don't worry about it. We have them for everything. These are just the ones that are there. It's like Baskin-Robbins. I promise you we have a flavor for you. So just to summarize, and I will be going to Baskin-Robbins later, use IDEAL. What we do is we give you great guidance and innovation to innovate and develop evidence. It's all about the question. I know I'm flogging that to death, but that's what research is, folks. It's questions, and we really emphasize asking the right question at the right time to get to the right study design and to get that innovation into the right place at the right time to the right person. It really helps to improve the quality of evidence. You can use it to improve the transparency and the reproducibility of surgical research, which is always problematic. All of us together can help improve the quality of evidence in surgery and innovation in surgery. So I highly recommend it. find more about us by going to our website. You'll find that not just our papers there, you'll also find helpful information, checklists. You're thinking of, you know, this is where my innovation is. I think I'm ready for stage 4. What would I start collecting in advance? We've got the guidance for you. We also have links to our YouTube channel. You'll find this presentation on our YouTube channel, but also a lot of the great presentations from our annual conferences. You can access them on YouTube. Also want to highly encourage you, if you're curious, become a member. You can find the website there and the link. Now, here's an important thing. Another thing I can't advise strongly enough or recommend enough. If you're planning a study, if you're looking for guidance or collaboration, you have an idea, you don't know how to take it forward, you have an idea, you want to collaborate on building the research for it, contact us about our advisory service. We have this excellent service. We can work with you and really collaborate and sort of and see where your idea goes. So definitely don't be shy, reach out, we are here. And I thank you for listening to me. It's been a pleasure.
Arsenio, thank you so much. And I want to thank all of the speakers. And Arsenio, excellent presentation. As always, I always learn so much from listening to you. And I always appreciate your slides as well. Really great slides. So we have a lot of questions actually from the chat, and I have a number of questions as well. We'll start with a question from Nico Bizzari. He's at Gemelli Hospital in Rome, Italy. And his question is, when a randomized trial is not feasible for sample size requiring too many patients, can we accept a lower level of evidence and make that our standard of care clinical practice? So Nico, thank you so much for joining. And of course, obviously, add any additional comments. And I'll ask you, Arsenio, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, so I think there you have to balance the real world that we live in against the ideal, and sometimes that will happen. That it would, if a randomized trial isn't feasible, though, I'm always curious about what makes it infeasible. You know, if it's difficult to recruit, is it difficult to recruit because the participants don't want to, or the surgeons don't want to? Is it difficult to recruit? It kind of depends on why you can't recruit. So I would want to step one back first and try and figure out what that is before deciding, well, we can't do a trial, well, let's accept something less. There are very good reasons sometimes why there is not a possibility of a trial. Sometimes it's just that there's nothing ethical to compare to, you know? That happens. In that case, there are other designs that we can use that will give us good evidence, but it really depends on what's holding up the recruitment.
Great, Arsenio. And Peter, you had your hand up.
Thank you, Pedro, and congratulations.
Thank you, Nico. Peter, you wanted to make a comment about that, Nico's question?
Yeah, I mean, just in addition to what Arsenio says, you referred to sample size, and it's one of the axioms of evidence-based medicine that the smaller the difference you expect between the two treatments, the larger the trial you need. And sometimes that makes the trial completely infeasible. But the risk here, and this is where the ethics of the ideal philosophy comes in, the risk here is that people give up at this stage and say, well, we can't do anything. I would argue that the ethical thing to do is to continue to do either an ideal 2B large prospective cohort study or a registry that includes the cases from both treatments. Because if you can't do a randomized trial, that's the least worst evidence you can get. And that's better than having no evidence. So I think that from an ethical point of view, that would be my answer. If it's sample size that's preventing you from doing the trial, do the next best thing, which is prospective cohort or registry.
So can I ask you a follow-up question then? Can you do, let's say, as you mentioned, a two groups registry with an intervention in one of the two groups? Because if you have an intervention, that's not an observational study, it's an interventional study. So you should do a, let's say, like single arm phase 2 study trial with an intervention and with no, let's say, direct comparison other than historical comparison.
Arsenio, I see you shaking your head. You want to take that one?
Yeah, there is. There are all these great new variations of that, but that is definitely possible. It just becomes very crucial what the outcome is, you know. But that is doable, and it's being done a lot, even with pharma now, just because it's becoming, some of their trials are becoming undoable because of cost and time. So I don't know enough specifics to answer in a solid way, but yes, that is possible. You know.
Excellent. So I have a question, and Joel, I'll turn to you for this one. And you showed the iceberg and the pyramid of evidence. And I
Yes.
think that certainly as we go through our training in medical school and residency, we always hear it's like, the gold standard is the randomized controlled trials. So what suggestions would you have for young investigators to say, I understand all of the ideal stages, but I just want to jump into a randomized controlled trial. What are your suggestions?
Well, I think I showed that there were so many variations that it's not so easy to do a randomized control trial. And but I would like to just go back to say that the question before, I think, is a dangerous one ethically. I just want to throw my voice in there. I agree with what Peter and Arsenio said about that. So this is the same sort of thing. If you have to have some data and some reason to do the study. You can't just say, well, I want to do an RCT. So you have to accumulate that. I mean, that's the whole point of the ideal collaboration, right? Or the framework, rather. You just have to keep working until you get that for things that are new and different.
So now, I wanted to ask, with regards to, and Arsenio, you mentioned procedures change over time, surgeons change over time, indications change over time, and particularly, when you're looking at surgical trials, particularly in our field in gynecologic oncology, if you look at the key surgical trials that have been done in the last 5, 10 years, 15 years, they usually take about 10 years. So how do we interpret some of these results when you say, well, you're not the same surgeon in 2010 than you are now? Hopefully you're a lot better. but like how do you put that in context?
Do you want a 1-hour answer? I mean, the problem also now is that the rate of change is much more rapid. I mean, it's dramatically more rapid. I mean, I think that touches on so many things. I think part of the problem there is it takes forever to get studies published anyway. So by the time you've got this great procedure and this great technique and you've published it, you probably did the study 3 years before someone saw it. That becomes a challenge anyway. It's not a topic for here, but it's one of the reasons to really push more open, faster publication for things and faster peer review, but good one, because this stuff, yeah, I don't have an answer for that really, because it's sort of, I mean, like you say, we're all evolving with the evidence and your skills evolve along with it. So I think that part of the reason that the observational, the registries are so important and the cohorts are so important is so we can see how this is changing over time, because learning curves as a field change over time. But as I said, the procedures, the people, we change. So we need to collect data for that, and we need to collect data for that in a way that people can actually access. There are registries, I know, for example, for some procedures and medical devices. I don't think we use them enough. We can contribute to them more. I think that's one of the great things about Ideal, is that we even start saying, you can start that registry data collection process much earlier on. You don't have to wait till it's a stage 4. Sometimes even in the stage 2, you say, hey, listen, this is something I want to keep developing. You start building that database already, so you can see, or even in something that's relatively new, you can look back even the last 3 years and see how it's been changing and how you're changing with it, not necessarily waiting until the cohort study gets published 10 years after. So it takes a little bit of innovation there, but we can do it.
Yeah. And Joel, I'll turn to you for this next question. Oftentimes we hear, we have never been taught this nowhere in medical school, in residency, in fellowship. So my question is like, when is the best time to teach these principles? And when you might say, well, a medical student is just thinking about surviving the first year, forget about stage 2A, 2B. But is it too late in fellowship, or as a faculty? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think that's an excellent question, Pedro. I'm a believer in early education, and I've taught at a lot of medical schools, from the most prestigious to the less prestigious, but they all have the same failing. They don't have any teaching relative to evidence-based medicine. And look at the governing body in surgery. The American College of Surgeons don't even use the word evidence-based medicine. The ACGME, which gives credence to every residency, only introduced last year the term evidence-based medicine in one of their milestones. So when you don't have medical schools or the governing bodies having an interest in it, it's hard to do. But I agree with you. I personally plumb, and I'm the site director for the surgery students at Downstate. I make them learn to do critical appraisals. No one has done that. So when are they going to learn to read a paper, for example, whenever they're finished? So this is a very complex topic. And I think what it needs is pushing from people like you and people like Peter and the trainees that you're training to demand that they get exposed to this stuff. You can't learn enough of it early enough.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe. We'll turn to a question from the chat. Osnat from Israel. Osnat, you want to ask your question?
Hi, thanks. Yes. Just about the questions following difficulties in recruiting and, performing RCTs, usually long-term follow-up. What are your thoughts of using the same patient as her own control? Like, for example, using the intervention on one side, like in the hemipelvis, in lymph nodes, or in the groin, and then compared to the other side, a contralateral, when you don't use the intervention, and then what are your thoughts about this?
So this has been done in real time. It's been done where you do a lymph node dissection on one side and not on the other. Of course, the original answer to that is the N of 1 study, but of course you can't do that if you're trying to innovate a new procedure. But it has limitations, obviously. It's not the same. So what you're referring to is the fact is that it's difficult to recruit adequate numbers of patients fast enough to get some of these trials done. That's the real issue, And you might get some answers by looking up, do a semantic scholar search on Jane Blaseby. Jane Blaseby is a trialist from Bristol, and she is the world's expert on how to get trials done. And I would use that as a resource. You'll find a lot of information there.
Great. Thank you, Joel. And the next question will go to a dear friend and colleague who not only looks very smart, is also super smart. And this question is for Arsenio, and this comes from Rene Pareja from Colombia.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for putting together all this valuable information. As a physician coming from low and middle income countries, we face a lot of challenges when trying to run important trials. So it's impossible for us to run a randomized clinical trial. What kind of trials, Arsenio, would you suggest to us to run in low and middle income countries? Thank you very much.
All right, so I will say, I know it sounds easy for me to say, you can get very creative some ways to be able to still run an RCT, but it's much harder with surgery devices. I realize that. I mean, in theory, the thing is, depends on what question you're asking. If you're trying to prove whether something's effective, that's going to be very difficult to do without the RCT. There are ways of doing the prospective development studies, like the 2Bs, that can give you, reasonable answers, but then it gets a bit complex after that. It sort of comes back to, can you use, for example, a historical cohort or something? I'm going to actually pass that to Peter, because we just had a whole conversation about that. So I'm passing it to him.
Oh. So, hi. René, buenos días. Encantado de encontrar. At the Ideal Collaboration Conference this year, we had a whole session on how we could use Ideal in lower income country surgery. And one of the challenges that we see, particularly in the really low income countries, is that people get given devices and technology and that don't look appropriate for their setting. The classic example of this is Ilizarov frames for external fixation of fractures, which work great in a high income country setting, But if you're going to do that in Sierra Leone, there are obvious risks. So the question that we sort of posed there is, do you need to do another randomized trial in a low-income country? That's crazy, you know? So we are trying to develop a network to evaluate the idea that if you have something that's been proven in a high-income country setting with a randomized trial, you should reevaluate it in your own setting after taking a very careful look at the potential differences between your setting and the one that it was trialed in, and start with an ideal 2A. Start very small so that you can identify any modifications that you can make to do the innovation more frugally or to avoid risks that didn't exist in the high-income country setting. That doesn't answer the question I think you were getting at of how can you do randomized trials in a low-income country setting. I think a lot of the expense of randomized trials across the world is down to the associated regulation. And I think that this is, I'm afraid to say, a matter for government more than for clinicians. But clinicians can have a strong influence in saying, look, if we can really, really simplify the regulatory processes around randomized trials, we can actually make them much more fit for purpose for countries with less generous grant funding and infrastructure. So, espero que esta es una buena respuesta.
But I'll add
Thank you very much.
That 2A is a really great way to start, you know.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, and to agree with Peter, you look at the randomized control trial for mesh in hernias that was done in Africa, where, you know, we use mesh that costs $10,000 in a hernia and don't think about it, but they can't do that. So what do? They cut up the free gates, mosquito netting to prevent malaria, and sterilized it, and did a trial. And it showed that it was perfect, just like the trials that were done here. So there are lots of different ways you can do it, in addition to what Peter told you.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. I think we have one last question from Nico Bizzari, and I think, you know, certainly it's a question that is representative for many who are in the audience as well. And his question is, how does someone get involved with IDEAL and the IDEAL framework?
Email us, go on the website. We want to hear from you.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're open arms.
Let us know you're interested.
Yeah, we'll be putting up a specific offer for IDEAL members and anyone who wants to join the collaboration shortly on the website. It's been a very informal collaboration for some years, and we're going to be formalizing membership, but we're not going to make it expensive or anything like that. And we will put up a description of benefits. Also, on the website, as Arseni already mentioned, we have an advisory service where we offer a free consultation if you have a new operation or device that you think might be helpfully tested using the IDEAL recommendations. So get in touch.
And they're always they're also ongoing projects often that can really use some, you know, it will be a great opportunity to collaborate and start working together. So, you know, we have that as well, and we're definitely happy to hear from you.
Excellent. Fantastic. Well, I want to thank, of course, obviously, all of the speakers, really fantastic presentations. We look forward to you sharing your slides with us and with our audience. I want to thank all of you who joined from all regions of the world, who registered. Really, very grateful for your engagement, your discussions, your questions, and really excited and looking forward to the next IDEAL webinar.